Hello everyone, we'll be going live in just a couple minutes. Well, good morning. Hi there, kids. Welcome to Storytime Live at the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. I'm Kathe Crowley Conn, author of the Badger biography, Juliette Kinzie, Frontier Storyteller. Let you take a look at this. And today, we're going to learn a little something new about Juliette Kinzie and why she's important. We'll read just a few selections from the book. And finally, I'll show you a really kind of cool craft project you can do at home. And while I'm talking, I may drop a few clues about why I think Juliette Kinzie is so cool. In fact, here's the first clue. This is Juliette. This is her daughter, Nellie. I'll tell you why that's important later. First, let me tell you 4 things about Juliette. Number 1, Juliette was born in 1806 and grew up in a fancy home in Connecticut. Connecticut is on the East Coast and is a little bit over 1,000 miles away, so very far from Wisconsin. When Juliette was young, the United States was young too. It was much smaller than it is today, and mostly it was centered on the East Coast. Most people lived there, and the United States went as far as Ohio, and then the area beyond Ohio, which includes Wisconsin and other parts of what we call the country now, were called the Northwest Territory or the frontier. Now, even though Juliette was living very comfortably in Connecticut in a fancy home, she was fascinated with the idea of the frontier. She thought it would be wild and empty, but once she got out here, she learned it had been home to the Native Americans and others for thousands of years. Here's my 4th point. Juliette she finally did get to come see it and traveled to the new frontier as a young bride. And she came to Fort Winnebago in Wisconsin and wrote about her experiences in a best-selling book called Waban. And Waban translates roughly to New Day in the Northwest. So why am I so fascinated with Juliette Kinzie in the year 2020? Well, I have 3 reasons why I think she's important to us today. Number 1, she left us a real-life story about what it was like to live in the new frontier. She was witness to, she actually saw it for herself, very important historic events and people and things and landscapes, and she shared her own story, what she saw, who she talked to, how she felt. She drew pictures of the landscapes. So very important for us to kind of get a sense of what it was like to live back then. Number 2, she listened to and remembered to tell us about the people that were living there, and especially girls and women, which really hadn't been heard about for a lot. So we have a recording now through her stories of what it was like to live on the frontier as a woman, a girl, and as a boy and a man. So we're grateful that we have these stories about how they were living during their historic time. And number 3, here's another clue. She had a very famous granddaughter. This granddaughter continued Juliette's tradition of being prepared to help and serve, loving the outdoors, and respecting others and being a good citizen. So that's just a little background information I wanted you to have before we started reading some of the chapters here. One of the things I liked personally about Juliette the most was, even though she was in challenging and difficult times when she was coming to the frontier, she was also cheerful. She was always cheerful, resourceful, and kind. and she loved to observe and write about people. And that's why we are lucky today to know about those communities. So we're going to start with the first chapter, Meet Juliette. Imagine moving to a new place far from home. What if you didn't have things that help you feel comfortable and safe? How would you feel if the land and the people were so different that you needed guides and interpreters to help you find your way? In the early 1800s, Juliette Kinzie grew up in a comfortable home in Connecticut. As a young girl, Juliette dreamed of adventure. When Juliette was 24 years old, she moved to a place called Fort Winnebago in a land once known as the Northwest Territory. Part of this land would later become Wisconsin. And actually, Fort Winnebago is up in Portage, Wisconsin, which many of you may know, and it's very close to Baraboo, which many of you may know about Baraboo and the Wisconsin Dells. So that's the area that she had moved to. Juliette arrived at Fort Winnebago in 1830. There were few towns or roads on the frontier. There were none of the conveniences that we enjoy today. Imagine looking out of your bedroom window and seeing nothing but forests and prairies for as far as you could see. Your nearest neighbor might live as many, many miles away. This is what the land looked like to Juliette. It was a place where people had to protect themselves from the weather and the wild animals. They had to grow or hunt most of their food, and they had to depend on the help of other people to survive. Juliette and her husband, John Kinzie, lived among the early settlers who worked at Fort Winnebago. Very few female settlers lived on the frontier in 1830, but Juliette was excited about the promise of new lands and adventures. When Juliette arrived, she believed the frontier would be wild and unsettled, but she quickly learned the land had been home to Indian peoples for thousands of years. Juliette and John moved to the frontier during a very troubling time in our country. In the 1830s, the U.S. government was removing Indians from their land so that the states could expand. During Juliette's time on the frontier, she made friends with the other settlers as well as the Indians who visited and lived around the fort. She learned about their cultures, customs, and their love of the land, and she came to believe that they had a right to practice their own beliefs and ways of life. I'm going to show you a picture that she drew of Fort Winnebago. The fort is here, and her home. So this was part of her telling her story, was also drawing pictures of what she saw maybe out her window or from the land that she lived on. She wanted to record it and share it with us today. They didn't have cameras back then. Juliette and John lived at Fort Winnebago for only 3 years, but it was a time of great change. The landscape, as Juliette knew it, was beginning to disappear as new towns and roads were built, and the ways of life for both Indians and settlers were quickly changing too. Juliette knew she was witnessing an important part of history. She wanted to make sure no one forgot about the lives of the Indians and settlers. She knew it was important to share her story in her own words, what she saw, what she thought, and what she learned. She wanted other people to learn from her own experiences. Juliette was one of a few people from that time to write down what was happening in this part of the country. Many years later, she wrote a book about her life on the frontier called Waban, The Early Day in the Northwest. I have a copy of an old book. It's not the first edition, but it's fairly old. And you can tell it was very fancy writing. It was an important book in that day. You'd call it a bestseller. People just couldn't get enough of these stories. Back on the East Coast, they really wanted to hear what it was like to live out here. Juliette also wrote letters to other people who could help her document this important history. One person she wrote to was a man called Lyman Draper. You might not know his name, but you will know that he is one of the people who started the Wisconsin Historical Society, and you'll recognize that. Here's his picture. Mr. Draper was busy forming the new State Historical Society of Wisconsin. He was interested in collecting stories from pioneers. Mr. Draper created one of the most important collections of historical documents in the country. And you can visit and see those today online, some of the very important artifacts he collected so that we, so many years later, would hear the stories of the earlier people. Juliette wrote letters to Mr. Draper describing the Indian leaders and the early days in Wisconsin and northern Illinois. Today, these letters are very valuable. They show us how people viewed their world in the early days of the United States. Much of what we know about Juliette Kinzie and her life comes from her letters and what she wrote in Waban. Juliette teaches us that everyone can have an important story to tell. Doesn't matter whether you're young or old, rich or poor. This is Juliette's story. Now, her story begins at a time before electricity, before TVs, before cars and airplanes. There were no roads out here. There were few roads on the East Coast. And as I mentioned, she lived a very comfortable life in a fancy home up on a bluff overlooking the river. So some people ask me, if she was so comfortable, why was she interested in the frontier? And I'm going to read a little part of the story that fills that in. Okay, so there's no telephone, no TV, no way to communicate other than writing letters. When Juliette was growing up, it was a special treat to receive letters in the mail. A letter might have to travel by special messenger across the wild lands, lakes, and rivers. A letter could travel for months before reaching its destination. So you can imagine young Juliette's excitement when she received a letter from her uncle who lived so far away, over 1,000 miles, in a place that was to become Chicago. Chicago, Illinois, November 6, 1820. Dear Juliette, although it is some time since I received the last 2 letters from you, I have not yet thanked you for them, but I do so now and do it with enthusiasm. I hope you will continue to send me more letters full of the same delightful spirit and humor. Your letters remind me of the charming gatherings we used to have around your mother's cheerful fireside. I trust those happy times will soon return. Meanwhile, you must devote an occasional letter to your uncle who loves you and sees with pride and affection the progress you are making in your education. And the letter would be signed by her uncle, Dr. Alexander Wolcott. I have a copy of one of his letters to her. Paper was very rare, so they have to write on both sides and then fold it up and make it into its own little envelope. And then they would send this out. When the recipient got it, you'd open it up and have to read many pages of news, but this was the way that you shared information. And she was very excited to get these letters from her uncle. This is why. Several years earlier, Juliette's uncle had left his comfortable home in Connecticut. He moved to a place called Fort Dearborn, which is now the city of Chicago. He worked as a doctor and as an Indian agent at the fort. He worked with soldiers, fur traders, and Indians, and helped explore the land. He sent long letters to Juliette. He described the people he met, the places he saw, and the challenges of life in what people often called Indian country. In the letter I just showed you, Juliette's uncle describes a boat trip on Lake Superior. He wrote about the huge, jagged rocks that towered over his head. The waves slapped against the rocks, and he heard spooky noises coming out of the water that sounded like they were coming from the very center of the earth. But the lake was also beautiful. Further along, he discovered a small waterfall where a river spilled onto the lake. He wrote to Juliette that it fell in one unbroken sheet, glittering with all the hues of the rainbow. You can imagine Juliette probably thought, what is this magical place where a traveler could be terrified by spooky sounds and then delighted by a glittering waterfall the next? It certainly did not sound like anything Juliette had seen in Middletown, Connecticut. The letters from her uncle filled Juliette's imagination. She imagined the beauty of the wild lands, the challenges of survival, and the excitement of living with different cultures. Juliette dreamed of a life of adventure, exploring the wilderness. And now she wondered how she could make that dream come true. So her uncle was very instrumental in instilling in her an excitement for adventure and a thirst for observing the wild lands. And her dream did come true. She married John Kinzie, who was an Indian agent in what would become Wisconsin. And he brought her to the Indian Agency House at Fort Winnebago. Let me show you. Here's another clue. This is a picture of it today. Juliette was new to the area. It was all new. New people, new landscapes, new animals. But the area had been home to the Ho-Chunk and wild animals long before they arrived. Speaking of animals, some kids have asked me, in the middle of all this wilderness with animals running around, did Juliette have any pets? Well, we don't really know, but we do know about one animal that intersected with her life for a bit, and I'm going to read you a little story about that. This is once she settled with her husband John at Fort Winnebago in the Indian Agency House, and they are interacting with all sorts of people there, the soldiers, the fur traders, the Native Americans. It was mostly the Ho-Chunk tribe there at that point. That was their lands. And Juliette was learning a lot from them, observing and learning and really getting to appreciate the culture. Juliette learned that gift giving was an important form of communication and respect between the Indians and settlers. The Indian women would bring Juliette gifts of venison, that's deer meat, ducks, pigeons, berries, wild plums, and cranberries. They would bring her beautiful mats for the floor and table, wooden bowls, ladles, and deerskin or porcupine quills. One of Juliette's favorite visitors was a young woman named Elizabeth. Elizabeth was the daughter of the Ho-Chunk leader, Dakure. Elizabeth suffered from an illness that made her joints sore, and Juliette saw that Elizabeth was in pain. Juliette offered her new friend a remedy, like a medicine or a little cure, to make her feel better. Elizabeth was very grateful to Juliette for her help. To her surprise, one day Elizabeth arrived with a thank you present for Juliette. It was a young fawn. Fawn is like a baby deer. Can you see that picture? Probably looked like that. The creature had soft eyes and a spotted coat. Juliette did not know how she would take care of a wild animal in her home. To her surprise, the fawn followed her like a pet dog. Juliette named it Fan. Wherever Juliette went, Fan would go too. At breakfast, Fan would lie under the table at Juliette's feet. One day, Juliette heard a rattling in the kitchen. She ran to see what was making all the noise. Her little pet, Fan, had climbed onto a shelf looking for a place to lie down among the dishes. Juliette realized Fan needed a cozy place to rest. So every morning when it was time for Fan to take her nap, Juliette would open a large green umbrella, set it up in the corner, and Fan would curl up underneath and fall fast asleep. Well, we know that we couldn't do that. We normally would not do that today, but that's what having a pet for Juliette was like back in the 1800s. We're lucky. There are many more stories here, so if you have an opportunity to read the rest of the book, you'll find out all about her childhood, her adventuresome travel from Connecticut to New York to Wisconsin, and her adventures and stories and insights about living in this land during that time. We, today, are very lucky to have 3 legacies from Juliette that we can enjoy today. And the first one is the Girl Scouts of the USA. Now, You're probably asking, what does Juliette Kinzie have to do with the Girl Scouts? Juliette Kinzie lived much sooner than the Girl Scouts. But this is a picture of Juliette Gordon Low. Juliette Kinzie was the grandmother of Juliette Gordon Low, and Juliette Gordon Low started the Girl Scouts of the USA. Young Juliette, known as Daisy, would visit and listen to her grandmother's story of her adventures in early days on the frontier. Many think that Juliette's spirit of adventure, resourcefulness, and cheerful attitude rubbed off on Daisy and her idea for starting the Girl Scouts. It's a great legacy. The second legacy, and legacy is something that you leave for other people, is the historic Indian Agency House. This is the home she lived in Wisconsin. It was actually a fancy home in Wisconsin for the 1830s. And it's currently in Portage, still exists today, and is one of the oldest houses in Wisconsin. It has been preserved as a historic house and museum. Once we're able to gather again after we're finished with this historic time, you can go visit the house, see exhibits, and walk on the ground that Juliette actually walked. But until that time, I'm told, I think you can take a virtual tour of the house and the exhibits if you check their website, and there may be a link on our Facebook page here. Starting Friday, I think you'll be able to actually take a peek inside the old house and see what life was like when Juliette lived there. And our third legacy is her book, Waban, The Early Day in the Northwest. Of course, the only reason we know anything about Juliette Kinzie and her life is because she kept notes and shared her story through Waban. We also have her pictures that I showed you, and we have her other insights, and it's an important document of what life was like, but it only exists because she observed and wrote and took notes. So you're not going to be surprised about the next thing I'd like to talk to you about. We have so many ways today in the 21st century to share stories. We can take a selfie, we can make a movie, we can text someone, we can keep an audio blog, we can live stream like today. But in Juliette's day, the only way to record your memories and your stories was to write a journal and keep record of what you saw and what you thought. So let's make a journal. Let me show you. Hold on here. We'll get here. It's never too late to start a journal. And here's a very simple craft activity. I have a link on the page to the full directions, something you can do at home. You don't need any fancy supplies. This is how I made this. I have a twig. Go outside. Get outside. It's a beautiful day today. Go outside and find a little twig. And if you can't find a twig, you could use a pencil. You could use a chopstick. You could use anything that's straight and is going to hold your binding here. So you need a twig or something straight. You need scrap paper if you've got some. You need a cover if you'd like, and I've used construction paper or cardstock. If you don't have cardstock, you could use an old empty cereal box, or you could use a paper bag and just use the brown paper from the bag. On the link where you have the directions, it'll show you how to simply put this together. I would take it apart now, but I'm afraid I wouldn't get it back in time for the end of our show here. This is using one simple rubber band. It's holding the whole thing together. And the reason why I like using the rubber band is if you finish your pages in here and you want to add more pages, you simply take the rubber band off, put more pages in, and then reattach it. But if you don't have a rubber band, You can use string, you can use a ribbon, you can use anything just to kind of tie it together. Anyways, this was something we made with some other kids, and as soon as you make it, you can start writing. I happen to believe that every day is a historic day. But just like Juliette, we're living in really historic times now in our country. And you're an important observer. Your story is going to be very important to what people in the future know about our time living with COVID-19, living in Wisconsin in the year 2020, living with your family, living with your friends. So write your stories and keep them and share them. Well, that's all I've got from Juliette Kinzie today. So I just want to sign off by saying, be safe, be well, and be kind. Goodbye.